Roger Pemberton said it the way a man says something he has been rehearsing in his truck for 20 miles, loud enough for the deputy behind him to hear, loud enough for the neighbors gathering at the end of the snow-packed driveway to hear. His voice cracked on the word arrested. His knuckles were white around a manila folder. 8 motorcycles stood in the side yard, buried to their saddlebags in fresh powder, chrome dulled under a sky the color of wet concrete. He shoved past the nearest of them, a broad man in a battered leather cut, and the man didn't move so much as let himself be moved, stepping sideways into a snowdrift without a word. Roger's shoulder caught a folded tarp draped over the porch rail and sent it sliding into the yard. A coffee mug someone had left on the rail steps tipped and shattered on the boards, and for a second, nobody said anything at all. Somewhere behind the screen door, a child's voice, small and hoarse, called out, "Gaddy?" Roger didn't know yet what had happened inside that house 12 hours earlier. He didn't know that the man he'd just shouldered into a snowbank, the one everyone in 3 counties was about to start calling a hero, had spent the darkest hour of that blizzard with his hands inside his daughter's airway, counting breaths out loud in a voice steadier than Roger's had ever been in his life. If you'd been standing at the back of that crowd right then, you'd have felt it too, that itch in your chest that says something's about to flip. Yo, 81 years old, alone on a county road in a whiteout, and she opens her door to 8 strangers covered in leather and road salt? I don't care how good your instincts are. That takes nerve. Let's get into it. Because by the time this story's over, you're going to wonder who the dangerous one in that yard really was. To understand what was happening on that porch, you have to go back to the afternoon before, when the radio in Eleanor Calloway's kitchen started saying words like whiteout and state of emergency in that flat. Official voice that means business. Everyone in Larkspur County called her Nell. She was 81 years old, and she had lived on the same 11 acres off Route 9 for 56 of them. In a white clapboard farmhouse with a porch her husband Walter had built, with his own hands, the summer after they married. The paint on the railings was the 3rd coat Walter had ever put on, applied the year before his heart gave out, and Nell had never found it in herself to repaint over his work since. The kitchen smelled the way it always smelled in winter, like wood smoke and the cinnamon she put in everything, and the wood stove ticked and settled the way it had ticked and settled for 40 years. A photograph of Walter, in his army uniform, sat on the mantel next to a coffee can stuffed with loose change for the church roof fund. The floorboards by the back door dipped where 2 generations of boots had worn a path to the mudroom. Walter and Nell had run a diner on Route 9 for 31 years. The kind of place truckers circled twice on the map before they found it the first time and never needed directions again after that. Calloway's Diner fed anybody who walked through the door, paying or not, and Nell had spent 3 decades pouring coffee for men who looked rough and turned out gentle, and men who looked respectable and turned out to be neither. She had learned a long time ago that the patch on a man's jacket told you a lot less than the way he said thank you. The diner had closed 9 years back when her knees gave out, but the habit of feeding strangers never did. Walter had died on this same road, on a night not so different from the one that was coming. A heart attack at 68 in February, with the roads drifted shut and the ambulance 40 minutes out instead of 12. Nell had held his hand at the kitchen table and talked to him about their first dance until the paramedics finally got the truck up the hill. And by then, it didn't matter how fast they drove. She never talked about it much. She kept his old toolbox in the mudroom exactly where he'd left it, the latch still sticky, a coffee ring permanently stained into the lid. There was a particular night, 11 years back now, that Nell still thought about more than she let on. A trucker named Sal had broken down on the same stretch of Route 9 in weather almost identical to what was rolling in now. And half the town had watched his rig sit there for 2 hours before anyone so much as slowed down. Nell had driven out in her bathrobe with a thermos of coffee and brought him back to the diner, fed him eggs at midnight, and let him sleep in the back booth until the tow truck could get through. People talked about it for a week. the way people in small towns talk about anything that breaks the pattern. Some of them admired it. A few of them told her she was lucky nothing happened. Nell never saw it as luck. She saw it as the only decent way to run a kitchen, and later, the only decent way to run a life. Walter used to tease her that she'd never met a stray she didn't bring home, and she always told him the same thing back. Better a house full of strangers than an empty one. That same afternoon, 200 miles south, 8 motorcycles pulled out of a hospital parking garage in a loose, practiced line, headed north on a charity run they did every December, hauling 2 trailers of donated toys for foster kids in 3 rural counties. They called themselves the Northbound Riders, and most of them worked day jobs nobody would guess from the leather. A welder, 2 long-haul drivers, a retired Marine, a woman who ran a daycare. At the front of the pack, on a black Road King with a faded patch that said Precker stitched under his road name, rode a man who had told almost none of them what he did for a living, and the 1 or 2 who knew had agreed a long time ago not to mention it. His name was Marcus Doyle. On weekdays he wore green scrubs instead of leather, and the hands that gripped his handlebars spent most of their hours holding scalpels and clamps instead. Inside the trauma bay, at Mercy General 200 miles south. He had been a trauma surgeon for 11 years. He had never once told a stranger on the road what he did, because he had learned the hard way, and more than once, that the moment people found out, they stopped seeing him and started seeing the job instead. Out here, with the cold biting through his gloves and a trailer full of donated dolls and toy trucks behind him, he wanted, for 1 weekend a year, to just be preacher, what nobody riding alongside him that afternoon understood, and what Roger Pemberton would have given a great deal not to find out the way he eventually did, was that the quiet man at the front of that pack had spent his childhood summers in a holler outside Pikeville, Kentucky, watching his grandmother set broken bones at her own kitchen table because the nearest hospital was 90 minutes away and half the families on the ridge couldn't have paid for it. Anyway, Ruth Doyle had never gone to medical school. She had learned from a county nurse, from a paperback anatomy book with a broken spine, and from 20 years of doing what needed doing. She raised Marcus after his parents died in a car wreck on Highway 80 when he was 9, and she taught him to set a splint before she ever let him touch a baseball glove. The stethoscope he kept rolled in his saddlebag, cracked tubing and all, had been hers first. He had it appraised once by a colleague who laughed and told him it was an antique worth exactly nothing and worth absolutely everything. And Marcus had agreed with both halves of that sentence. Ruth was 86 now, living at Cedar Hollow Care Home, 3 counties over, her hands too unsteady these days to thread a needle. Marcus visited her every other Sunday and always brought her the same butterscotch candies. And she always asked him the same question: "Are you still listening to people before you fix them?" He always said yes. It was, more or less, the only rule he'd ever followed. Mercy General was not a small operation. It served as the only Level 1 trauma center for 4 counties, the place state troopers and rural ambulance crews alike routed their worst calls toward. And Marcus had spent 11 years building a reputation inside those walls that had nothing to do with how he spent his Saturdays. Residents requested rotations under him specifically. The chief of surgery had tried twice to talk him into a department head position he kept politely declining, partly because he liked the trauma bay too much to trade it for an office, and partly because, as he put it once to Ruth on a Sunday visit, titles had a way of making people stop listening to you the way they used to. None of that mattered to anyone in Larkspur County yet. To them, that gray morning, he was still just a man in a leather cut, standing on an old woman's porch. The reason Marcus rode under a name instead of a title went back to a single bad night 3 years earlier, when a patient's family had found out who he was, before he'd had the chance to introduce himself properly, and had spent the next 40 minutes in the family consultation room, asking him to justify, defend, and prove himself in ways no colleague of his had ever been asked to. He had learned that night that the white coat could open doors just as fast as it could close them, and that some people decided what kind of doctor they were looking at before he'd said a single word about medicine at all. So when he climbed onto a Road King on a Saturday, he left the coat hanging in his locker on purpose. Out here, nobody asked him to prove anything. They just handed him a wrench, or a plate of eggs, or, every December, a trailer full of toys to deliver, and let that be enough. The toy run itself had started small, 6 years back. 2 bikes and a cardboard box of donated stuffed animals dropped off at a county shelter that had nearly closed its doors that winter. It had grown every year since. Word passed from clubhouse to clubhouse the way good ideas do among people who already know what it's like to be misjudged walking into a room. By the time the northbound riders pulled out of that parking garage, with the storm still 2 states away on the radar, the run had become the thing half the club looked forward to all year. The one weekend where the leather and the patches stopped being something people had to explain. The storm caught the northbound riders 40 miles short of their last stop. The trailer hitch on the lead truck sheared clean off on a patch of black ice just past the Larkspur County line, and what had been light snow turned, in the space of 20 minutes, into something that swallowed the road whole. Visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature dropped with it. 8 bikes and a crippled trailer sat stranded on the shoulder of Route 9 as the light went out of the sky early, the way it does before a real blizzard. And Tank Sully, the club's president, a broad man with a gray beard and a voice like gravel in a coffee can, made the call nobody wanted to make. They were not getting anywhere tonight, and they needed shelter before the cold did what cold does. Before that call, though, the day had already taught them something about Larkspur County, one small cruelty at a time. The first of it came at the hardware store on Main Street, where Tank had stopped to buy a replacement clevis pin for the trailer hitch before it failed completely. The owner rang him up without looking at him twice, which felt, for a moment, like nothing at all. It was the man browsing the next aisle over who made the day's first impression, loudly telling his son to come stand by him, eyes flicking over Tank's cut the whole time like he was watching for a weapon to appear. Tank paid an exact change, said "have a good one," and left without raising his voice, the bell over the door jangling behind him, into a silence that felt heavier than it should have. At the gas station, on the edge of town, the kid behind the counter took one look at 8 men in road leathers, stamping snow off their boots, and told them the bathroom was out of order, even though the woman who'd walked out of it 30 seconds earlier hadn't said a word about it being broken. Roads icing up, the clerk muttered to no one in particular as he rang up their coffee, loud enough to be heard. Guess we'll see what kind of trash blows in early this year. Marcus didn't argue. He paid for his coffee, said thank you the way Nell Calloway would have recognized, and walked back out into the cold, the bell on the door behind him sounding exactly like the one at the hardware store had. At the diner, 2 miles down, a man in a quilted hunting jacket leaned over from the next booth while they waited on grilled cheese and a pot of coffee, and said it loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Lock up your daughters, boys. The circus just rolled into town." A few people laughed. Nobody told him to stop. The waitress refilled their cups without quite meeting anyone's eyes, the way people do when they've decided the safest thing is to be invisible. Bertie Coleman's jaw tightened at the booth across from Marcus, and he caught her eye and gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent agreement that today was not the day to make it worse. On their way out of town, a Larkspur County cruiser pulled them over on a stretch of road where they'd done nothing but exist. Deputy Crandall took his time walking up, took his time running 8 licenses through dispatch while snow built up on his hat brim, and made a point of asking Tank twice, in 2 different ways, whether any of them had outstanding business in the area. Someone, it turned out later, had called it in. 8 bikers idling near a row of houses, the caller said, like they were casing the place. They were idling because Lupe Reyes was tightening a bolt on her own bike. Crandall let them go after 25 minutes with nothing but a warning about their taillights and not one apology for the 25 minutes. He kept his hand resting near his belt the entire time he spoke to them, a habit Marcus noticed, and said nothing about, the way he'd learned not to say anything about a great many things that day. Through all of it, Marcus said almost nothing. He held his coffee cup with both hands to keep them warm. And when the man in the hunting jacket made his joke about daughters, Marcus simply looked at the menu a little longer than he needed to. There was a small tremor in his jaw when Crandall asked his question twice. He didn't let it reach his voice. By the time they finally rolled out of town toward the county line, none of them had said a cruel word back to anyone, and every single one of them was carrying something heavier than they'd had that morning. Yo, can we talk about this for a second? 8 strangers minding their own business, just trying to get a hot meal and gas before a storm. And every single person in that town treated them like a threat before they'd done a single thing wrong. That's not caution. That's a story people had already decided to believe. Hold that thought, because in about an hour, the only people in Larkspur County willing to open a door for these men were going to be an 81-year-old widow and her 7-year-old granddaughter. By the time Nell Calloway looked out her kitchen window and saw a line of hazard lights blinking dimly through the snow at the bottom of her drive, the storm had stopped being weather and started being an emergency. Her granddaughter Madison, whom everyone called Maddie, was staying the weekend while her parents attended a holiday fundraiser 2 towns over, and the 2 of them had spent the afternoon making popcorn strings for a tree that didn't exist yet. Nell didn't think twice. She pulled on Walter's old barn coat, the one that still smelled faintly of motor oil after all these years, and drove her ancient pickup down to the shoulder of Route 9, through snow that came up over the running boards. She found 8 people standing in a half circle around a dead trailer, faces raw with cold, breath freezing in clouds, and not one of them looking the slightest bit dangerous to her, just cold and stuck and a long way from anywhere warm. Well, you can't stay out here, she told them, the same way she used to tell truckers to come in out of the rain. I've got a wood stove and more soup than 2 people can eat. Bring what you can carry and leave the rest. It'll be there in the morning. Tank started to explain who they were, started the speech he'd clearly given 100 times to people who needed convincing, and Nell cut him off before he got 3 words in. I ran a diner for 31 years, young man. I've fed worse-looking men than you, and better-looking men who turned out worse. Get in the truck before you lose a finger to frostbite. They followed her up the hill in a slow, careful line, walking their bikes the last stretch where the snow made riding impossible. 8 strangers and 1 old woman trusting each other on the strength of nothing but a warm window glowing through the dark. Inside, the farmhouse filled with the smell of wet leather drying by the stove, and the sound of 8 people trying to take up as little space as possible in someone else's home. Maddie, who had never in her life seen a motorcycle up close, attached herself almost immediately to Lupe, who let her sit on an upturned bucket and hold a socket wrench like it was the most important tool in the world. Marcus settled into a kitchen chair near the stove, quiet, watching the room the way he watched a trauma bay, cataloging exits and edges without meaning to. When Bertie Coleman sliced her palm open on a broken hinge in the mudroom looking for extra blankets, it was Marcus who reached for Nell's sewing kit before anyone else moved, who irrigated the cut with water warmed on the stove, who pinched the wound closed and ran 3 small, even stitches through it with a steadiness that made Nell pause in the doorway and watch a beat longer than she needed to. You've done that before, she said. It wasn't a question. Once or twice, Marcus said, and went back to taping gauze over the stitches and didn't say another word about it. Nell noticed she didn't ask. There was something in the careful, unhurried way he worked that told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was, even if she couldn't have named the job. None of them knew yet how much that quiet competence was about to matter. For a few hours, the storm outside and the warmth inside made an easy kind of peace. Nell put on a second pot of soup without being asked, the kind with the ham bone she'd been saving, and let Maddie hand out bowls to grown men twice her height, like she'd been doing it her whole life. Tank told a long, mostly true story about a flat tire in Sturgis that had everyone laughing hard enough to fog the windows. And Lupe taught Maddie how to properly hold a flashlight steady while someone else worked, a skill the girl announced very seriously that she intended to use forever. Marcus sat closest to the stove, listening more than talking, the way he always did. The firelight catching the edge of Ruth's old stethoscope, where it sat coiled in his open bag by his boots. Outside, the wind kept building. Nobody in that kitchen had any idea how soon they would need every bit of that easy piece to carry them through what was coming. Sometime after 11, with the wind throwing snow against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass, Maddie woke up coughing. Within minutes, the cough had turned into something else entirely. A high, thin wheeze with every breath in, her small chest pulling in at the ribs with the effort of it, her lips going the color of old bruises at the edges. Nell had seen croup before, had seen plenty of sick children in 56 years, and she knew inside of 30 seconds that this was not croup. This was something closing a 7-year-old's airway from the inside, fast, in a house at the end of a road the county plows wouldn't reach until morning. The phone lines were down. Cell service in that valley had never been reliable on a clear day, let alone in a whiteout. Nell's hands shook, dialing 911 anyway, getting nothing but a dead, flat silence on the line. Marcus was already moving before she finished trying. He knelt in front of Maddie at eye level, his voice dropping into a register so calm it was almost a different person speaking. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm Marcus. I'm a doctor, and I'm going to help you breathe. Okay? I just need you to look right at me." He pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, counted under his breath, lifted her chin with 2 fingers, and looked down her throat by flashlight, and said a word out loud that made Tank go pale. Anaphylaxis. Somewhere in that house, something Maddie had eaten, or touched, or breathed, had triggered a reaction that was now swelling her airway shut, and a sealed county road stood between her and the nearest hospital. He sent Lupe digging through his saddlebag for the small black kit he never rode without, the one the others had assumed for years held nothing more interesting than bandages and aspirin. It held an epinephrine auto-injector, expired insurance paperwork be damned, a few vials, a stethoscope older than some of the men in that room. He administered the epinephrine into her thigh with hands that did not shake once, narrating every step out loud, partly for Nell, partly to keep Maddie's attention on his voice instead of her own panic. For a few minutes it looked like enough. Then her breathing tightened again, the wheeze climbing back into her throat. And Marcus felt the room go very quiet around him, in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone in them understands, without being told, that the situation has gotten worse. He did not let that quiet reach his face. He repositioned her, adjusted the angle of her chin, talked her through 3 slow breaths in a row, like he was counting her down to sleep, instead of counting her back from the edge of something far worse. And when her color started to come back the second time, Tank, watching from the doorway with his hands pressed flat against the frame, finally let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. When her breathing didn't fully clear on its own, he improvised an airway adjunct from what the kit and the kitchen could offer, working by flashlight and wood stove glow with the same unhurried precision he'd used on Bertie's hand, monitoring her pulse against his watch, counting her breaths out loud in a steady, unbroken rhythm that filled the whole kitchen. Nell sat on the floor beside him the entire time, Maddie's small hand wrapped in both of hers, and found herself thinking, in the strange sideways way the mind drifts during an emergency, of the 40 minutes she'd once spent waiting for an ambulance that came too late for Walter. This time, she realized, she wasn't waiting alone. Tank got a weak cell signal on the porch roof an hour later, standing in snow up to his knees, and finally raised a dispatcher. Help was coming, the dispatcher said. But the plows hadn't reached that stretch of Route 9 yet, and it would be hours, not minutes. So Marcus stayed where he was, on the kitchen floor of a stranger's farmhouse, monitoring a 7-year-old's vitals through the entire second half of the night. Refusing the coffee Nell kept trying to press into his free hand, never once raising his voice above the volume a child needed to hear to feel safe. By the time the first gray light came up over the ridge and an ambulance finally ground its way up the drive behind a county plow, Maddie was breathing on her own, color back in her lips, asleep against Nell's shoulder, with Marcus's jacket draped over her like a blanket. The EMS captain who walked in, a sharp-eyed woman named Lena Ortiz, who had run more rural emergencies than she could count, took one look at the IV line taped neatly to the back of Maddie's hand. The oxygen setup improvised from a nebulizer Nell hadn't even known she still owned, the meticulous handwritten log of vitals on a torn paper towel, and stopped cold in the doorway. "Who did this?" she said, and it wasn't really a question either. It was right about then, with the ambulance lights still washing red and white across the snow, that Roger Pemberton's truck came skidding up the same drive. 12 hours and one panicked phone call too late to have done a single useful thing, and a great deal too early to know what he was about to walk into. He had not come to thank anyone. He had spent the night on the phone instead of on the road. Because the roads were impassable, and because, if he was honest with himself later, some smaller part of him hadn't wanted to risk his own neck for a mother-in-law he'd quietly decided for over a year now had outlived her ability to make good decisions. What he had done instead was call a neighbor down the road, Doris Higgins, who had seen the headlights of 8 motorcycles turning into Nell's drive the evening before, and had been only too happy to share her alarm. He had called the county's Adult Protective Services emergency line and reported his mother-in-law as endangered, alone with a group of armed strangers in a blizzard. He had called Deputy Crandall directly, a man he golfed with twice a summer, and demanded a welfare check the moment the roads cleared, regardless of conditions. He had spent the night building a file, the same folder now tucked under his arm, full of notes for the guardianship petition he had been quietly assembling for months, the one that would move Nell into Heritage Pines assisted living and put her 11 acres, with their creek frontage and their quiet, unmentioned mineral rights, on the market by spring. So when Roger came up that porch in the gray morning light and saw 8 motorcycles in the yard and a man in a leather cut standing on his mother-in-law's steps, he did not see a man who had spent the night keeping his daughter alive on a kitchen floor. He saw exactly the threat he had already decided was there, and he reacted to the story in his head instead of the scene in front of him. "Get your hands off her porch rail before I have every one of you arrested for trespassing," he said, and shoved past Marcus hard enough to send him stumbling into the snowbank. And the morning that had almost gone quietly into the history of one family instead became the morning the whole county would be talking about by nightfall. Deputy Crandall, standing a few feet back with his hat brim already crusted in fresh snow, said nothing. Mrs. Higgins, watching from her own porch, with a mug of coffee going cold in her hands, said nothing either. Roger flipped open his folder right there on the steps, voice rising, words like endangerment and incompetent and criminals coming out of him in a rush he'd clearly been saving up all night, loud enough that half the families on that stretch of Route 9 came out onto their own porches to watch. "She's 81 years old," he said, jabbing a finger at the men standing quietly in the snow. "And you people let her open her door to a motorcycle gang in a blizzard. I don't care what excuse you've got. I'm having her declared incompetent before the week's out, and you're all going to be explaining yourselves to a judge." Nell stepped out onto the porch behind him in her bathrobe, hair still flat on one side from a night spent on the kitchen floor, and her voice, when it came, was steadier than anyone expected from a woman who hadn't slept. "Roger Pemberton, you will lower your voice on my property," she said. "That man right there sat on my kitchen floor until sunup, keeping your daughter breathing, and you are standing on my porch calling him trash before you've so much as asked how she is." Roger's mouth opened and closed once, the folder still clutched against his chest, and for the first time that morning, he had nothing ready to say. Marcus stood up out of the snowbank, slowly brushed it off his jacket, and said nothing at all. Tank started to speak, and Marcus put a hand lightly on his arm, a small motion that said, "Wait." Inside the ambulance behind them, Maddie stirred at the sound of her father's raised voice and started to cry. And that, more than anything Roger had said, was what finally got Captain Ortiz moving toward the porch, with her clipboard still in hand. "Sir," she said, in the flat, unhurried voice of someone who has diffused 100 worse scenes than this one, before you have anyone arrested, "I think you should hear what happened in that kitchen last night." She told it plainly, the way EMS reports get told. No embellishment needed. Severe anaphylactic reaction. Airway compromise. An improvised intervention performed under field conditions with no advanced equipment and no backup, sustained for nearly 5 hours. That, in her professional opinion, was the only reason his daughter was breathing on her own in the back of that ambulance instead of being intubated in an ICU, or worse. She held up the torn paper towel, covered in handwritten vitals, timestamps recorded every 15 minutes through the night, in small, steady handwriting. "Whoever did this," she said, looking directly at Marcus now, "did not get lucky. This is textbook. This is better than textbook." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the recognition of something professional crossing her face. "Doyle?" she said slowly. "Dr. Marcus Doyle." "Mercy General." A silence dropped over that porch heavier than the snow. There it is. That's the moment. Right there. 8 strangers. Got called criminals. Trash a motorcycle gang. All morning long. And it took one EMS captain, reading a name off a hospital badge, for the whole story to flip on its head. I'd bet good money half that crowd standing in the yard felt their stomachs drop right along with Rogers. Keep watching, because the apology that's coming is not going to be the gracious kind. The doorbell camera mounted above Nell's screen door. The one Walter had installed 2 years before he died, and Nell had never quite figured out how to turn off, had captured the whole scene in grainy infrared. The front door opening close to midnight, the careful triage in the front hallway light, the hours of quiet, steady work that followed. Tank pulled it up on his phone without being asked and held it out, not as a weapon, just as a fact, the way you'd hand someone a map when they were lost. The footage time-stamped everything Captain Ortiz had just described, second by second, hour by hour, a record that needed no one's word taken on faith. It was the third deputy to arrive that morning, Sheriff Hutchins himself, who pulled Crandall aside in the yard once the full picture had settled over the scene, and the conversation, though quiet, was not gentle. You ran their plates, their licenses, 25 minutes of dispatch time on a bias call that had nothing behind it, Hutchins said, low enough that only Crandall and the snow between them could hear it clearly. And not one of you thought to run a welfare check on an 81-year-old woman alone on this road until her son-in-law called it in for the wrong reasons. We are going to talk about that, at length, back at the station. The same neighbor who'd called in 8 bikers casing houses the afternoon before was standing not 30 feet from the man who had just saved a little girl's life with his bare hands and a sewing kit. And Hutchins did not love the math on that. The Adult Protective Services investigator, who arrived an hour later to assess the endangered Eleanor Calloway, found a woman fully in possession of her faculties, a granddaughter alive and improving by the hour, and a guardianship file that, on review, looked a great deal less like concern and a great deal more like a man with a folder full of motive. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, flipping through pages of notes dated weeks before the storm had ever appeared on a forecast. "This file references a development appraisal on the property dated 3 weeks ago. I'm going to need you to explain to me how that's relevant to your mother-in-law's safety, because right now, it reads like something else entirely." Roger had no answer ready for that question, and the silence that followed it told the yard everything the folder itself hadn't. The waitress from the diner, a woman named Patty, who had refilled their coffee cups without meeting their eyes the afternoon before, read about the whole thing in the Gazette 2 days later with her own coffee going cold in front of her. She thought about the man in the hunting jacket and his joke about daughters, about how she'd laughed along just enough to be polite and not enough to mean it, and about how she hadn't said a single word either way. She started keeping a fresh pot brewing every December after that, just in case the northbound riders came back through, though it would be another 2 years before they did. Carol Pemberton had arrived 20 minutes earlier, breaking every speed law on the county roads once the lines finally cleared, and had spent those 20 minutes hearing the whole story unravel, one wave at a time. The man her husband had just called trash, the man whose hands had kept her daughter breathing through the worst night of her life. She did not say much to Roger right then. She didn't need to. The look she gave him said all of it. "I think," Carol said quietly, "you owe this man something." Roger Pemberton stood on that porch in front of his wife, his mother-in-law, a county sheriff, an EMS captain, and 8 strangers in leather who had not said one cruel word to him in return for everything he'd thrown at them. And he had to find an apology, somewhere inside himself, that he had clearly never expected to need. It came out small and stiff. The words of a man choosing each one like it cost him something. "I appreciate," he said, looking somewhere past Marcus's shoulder instead of at his face, "what you did for Madison." He did not say sorry. He did not look anyone in the eye while he said it. It was, everyone standing there understood, the absolute minimum a person could say and still technically be apologizing. And it was clear from the set of his jaw how much it cost him to manage even that much. Marcus let the silence sit for a moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice was as calm as it had been at 2 a.m. over Maddie's bed. "Your daughter didn't care what I had on my back last night," he said. "She just needed somebody to stay. You might want to ask yourself why that mattered so much more to her than it did to you." He picked up his jacket from the snowbank, shook it out, and went to check on Maddie instead of waiting for a reply. Hold up. The man saved a child's life on a kitchen floor with a 40-year-old stethoscope and a sewing kit, and the first thing he got from her own father was a shove into a snowbank. I don't know about you, but I needed Roger to say more than 4 words into that folder of his. Stick with me, though, because the next part is where this whole county learned exactly what kind of reckoning was coming. Word moves fast on a road with this few houses on it, and faster still once Doris Higgins, the same neighbor whose phone call had started the whole chain of accusations, found herself telling the story at the feed store. 2 days later, with an entirely different ending than the one she'd been ready to believe. By the end of the week, the Larkspur County Gazette had run the story under a photograph of 8 motorcycles parked outside Mercy General, where the northbound riders had gone, helmets in hand, to visit Maddie during her 2-day observation stay. The hospital's chief of surgery gave a short statement to a local television crew, confirming what half the county already suspected, that Dr. Marcus Doyle had quietly been one of Mercy General's most respected trauma surgeons for over a decade, and that what he'd done on that kitchen floor, under those conditions, with that equipment, was the kind of intervention residents study in textbooks, not something most attendings would have attempted without a full operating room behind them. Roger Pemberton's guardianship petition, filed in haste and built on a foundation that had collapsed in front of a sheriff, an EMS captain, and a state investigator, was dismissed by the county court within the month, the judge noting on the record that the timing and substance of the complaint raised, in her words, significant questions about its underlying motive. Adult Protective Services opened its own brief review of the false report, not of Nell Calloway, but of the man who'd filed it. Roger withdrew his name from the town council re-election list that spring without much explanation, and the insurance firm, where he worked, quietly distanced itself from the local headlines that had followed his name for a month. Deputy Crandall sat through a retraining course on bias-based policing that the Sheriff's Department instituted countywide that winter, a direct result, Sheriff Hutchins said plainly at a town meeting, of a stop that should never have taken 25 minutes for 8 men who hadn't broken a single law. Doris Higgins, for her part, never made another panicked phone call about a neighbor's company again, and took, instead, to bringing a pie up the hill to Nell's porch, most Sundays. An apology delivered the only way she knew how to give. 1. At the town hall meeting that February, The one called specifically to address what half the county was now calling the Route 9 incident. Sheriff Hutchins stood at the front of a packed room and said, without much room for argument, that a county that judged people by their jackets instead of their actions was a county that would keep missing the difference between a threat and a blessing right up until it cost somebody their life. A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably, more of them, including the same man from the hardware store who'd pulled his son in close that first afternoon, stood up afterward and shook Marcus's hand on their way out the door, an apology with no words attached to it at all, which was, in its own way, still an apology. Roger and Carol Pemberton's marriage did not fully recover from that winter. They stayed together, worked at it, went to counseling twice a month in the city. But something had shifted between them on that porch that neither of them ever fully talked their way back from. The moment Carol had watched her husband choose his own pride over his daughter's life in the space of a single sentence, Maddie, for her part, remembered almost none of the argument. What she remembered was a man's calm voice in the dark, counting her breaths, telling her she was doing great. 2 years later, the white farmhouse on Route 9 looks almost the same from the road, except for a new awning over the porch, built by 8 sets of hands the same December weekend they came back. On purpose this time, with better weather and a trailer full of toys that actually made it to where it was going. They call it Eleanor's Light now. The unofficial way station marked on a hand-drawn map the northbound riders keep taped inside their clubhouse. The one stop on the annual toy run where the coffee is always hot and the door is never locked, blizzard or not. Maddie Pemberton is 9 now, missing her front teeth, and absolutely certain she wants to be a doctor, a paramedic, or a biker when she grows up, and hasn't yet decided she has to pick just one. She still calls Marcus Doyle Uncle Doc, and he still brings her a stethoscope-shaped chocolate every December, a joke that gets funnier to both of them every year. The donations that came in after the local news picked up the story, more money than either Nell or Marcus knew what to do with, or particularly wanted for themselves, went instead into a scholarship fund for rural paramedic training, named for Walter Calloway, the man whose own emergency 4 decades earlier had taught his widow exactly how much a few extra minutes could matter. Mercy General and the northbound riders together built and equipped a winter mobile response van that now patrols the worst stretches of County Road every storm season, stocked with the same kind of supplies that once had to be improvised from a sewing kit and a stove. The first paramedic trained on a full Walter Calloway scholarship graduated that spring. A young woman from 2 towns over who had grown up watching ambulances struggle up the same icy grade that had once cost Nell her husband, and who asked, when she accepted the certificate, to shake Nell's hand personally before anyone else's. At the county line on Route 9, where the trailer hitch sheared off 2 winters ago, there's a small weatherproof shelter now stocked with blankets, a defibrillator, and emergency supplies, with a modest plaque bolted above the door that reads simply, the Calloway Doyle Winter Response Post, for every traveler who needs a door opened. Tank still rides past it every December on the toy run, and taps the plaque twice with 2 knuckles, a habit none of the others have ever asked him to explain. Ruth Doyle watched the local news segment about her grandson from her recliner at Cedar Hollow, the volume turned up loud the way she always kept it now. And when the anchor said the words, trauma surgeon, and saved her life, in the same sentence, her hand came up slowly and pressed flat against her chest, and she sat very still for a long moment, watching the screen with an expression none of the staff who knew her had ever quite seen on her before. When Marcus visited the following Sunday with her butterscotch candies, she didn't ask him her usual question. She already knew the answer. Now look, you know the drill by now. Names changed, details folded together, dramatized where it needed to be, because that's how these stories work. But somewhere out there tonight, on some stretch of road, nobody's watching. There's an old woman deciding whether to open her door, and a stranger deciding whether kindness is worth the risk of being misjudged for it. That part isn't fiction. That part happens every single day in 100 small versions in towns just like this one. So tell me down in the comments, would you have opened that door the way Nell did, or would you have called it in the way Roger's neighbor did? I want to hear it. And if this story got you even a little, do me a favor and hit that like button, drop a comment, share it with somebody who needs the reminder, and subscribe, because we've got a whole lot more of these waiting for you.